Chegou às telas de Hollywood a discussão em torno da cura gay. Como ficou conhecida a polêmica e discutível terapia que promete converter a orientação sexual de uma pessoa. O filme Boy Erased, Uma Verdade Anulada, esquentou o debate sobre esses centros de conversão gay nos Estados Unidos. É uma prática condenada por médicos e psicólogos, mas ainda aceita e defendida por muitos no país, incluindo o vice-presidente Mike Pence. Boy Erased é baseado no livro do mesmo nome do americano Garrard Conley, que foi enviado pelos pais a um centro de conversão gay quando tinha 19 anos.
Jared, God will not love you the way that you are.
As práticas de terapia da conversão podem envolver sessões de terapia, hipnose, tratamento para dependentes, uso de medicamentos, eletrochoques, confinamento e até estupros corretivos em alguns países da África e da Ásia. Em entrevista ao Milênio, Garrard Conley deu detalhes sobre o que viveu e como deu uma guinada na sua história. Com 33 anos, ele, que saiu do interior de Arkansas, mora em Nova York com o marido.
So let's talk first about your book. So when did you write the book?
Wow. So the book was published in May of 2016, and I think I started writing it 2 years before that.
So how many years after the facts?
A decade.
A decade.
Yeah.
It took you a decade to...
I did not want to talk about it, and my dad and I didn't talk about it at all. You know, not to spoil it or anything, but whenever I came back from conversion therapy, my father said, "Did it work?" And my mom and I laughed. We were like, "No, it didn't work." And we swept it under the rug from that point on. We didn't really talk about it at all. And anytime it would come up in conversation, like when I would meet somebody new, I would try to be very flippant about it because I thought it was so dumb to have ever gone into conversion therapy. You know, I felt really stupid for having done that. And I would say, I went to conversion therapy, it didn't work, the end. And then, you know, book closed.
Why did you decide to write?
I started reading all of these blogs at the time. You know, this was when MySpace still existed. And on these blogs, they were survivors of conversion therapy. That's what we call ourselves, survivors, because a lot of people committed suicide. And they were telling about how they were having trouble being in a relationship, or, you know, when they were intimate with someone, it would feel like their skin was on fire, or they would feel a sense of deep shame. And I was not able to laugh at that. You know, I suddenly saw my own experience reflected in those words. And I also knew that people who had tried to write about this before, they often wrote about it in a very dry way because there was no nuance, simply because they hadn't processed their emotions. And I'd spent about 10 years traveling the world. I went to Ukraine to be in the Peace Corps, and I taught HIV/AIDS training in a village there. I did a degree in queer studies back in America. So I'd processed a lot of what had gone on, and I'd had a lot of time to think about it and read a lot of books and get caught up on the world. So I felt like I was in a position to tell the story, perhaps because I'd only been at an ex-gay facility for 2 weeks. I hadn't been there like some people for 2 years. I'd been in one-on-one therapy for 6 months and then a 2-week period at Love in Action where I attended conversion therapy. But, you know, I was scarred, but I wasn't ruined. You know, my life didn't feel like it was in complete shambles and I could build myself back up. Whereas a lot of people, you know, they were in conversion therapy for 2 or 3 years. They lost people who committed suicide that were their friends. Their families rejected them. They were homeless. There are all sorts of stories like that. And you can imagine trying to write your story from that perspective of that much damage would be incredibly difficult. And I knew from the beginning, I didn't just want to write my story. I wanted to write my parents' story, why they sent me to conversion therapy. I wanted to look at the sort of religious history that had brought us to that point, and I also wanted to look at the political situation at that time. And the only way to do that is to be okay with your past to a certain degree.
So why did your parents send you to the conversion therapy?
Ooh, the million-dollar question. I think it's a factor of a number of factors. So one, they had only seen really negative portrayals of LGBTQ people in the media. They saw people dying of AIDS. That was in their mind. And even to this day, these people still believe that it's associated with LGBT people only, even though those statistics are not true anymore. But they just believed that if I were to live openly as a gay man, that my life would be ruined and that I would have no future. And when you look at it from that perspective, when you grant them that kind of compassion, you can begin to see why they did what they did.
It was out of love.
Yeah, it was out of love. And often when we do things out of love, it can actually be pretty terrifying. It's not always a positive thing to do something out of love, especially if the love is misguided. But they were, you know, I always say you scream at the people who are in power who do this, but you talk to the people who are not in power. And my parents, I had to talk to understand, because they told me, and they aren't lying, I've done all this research, they approached a big church called the Bellevue Baptist Church in Memphis, Tennessee. Whenever I was outed, they said, what should we do? And the church said, here's a brochure, here's what you do, this is the way to cure him.
O centro onde Conley passou 2 semanas é uma das centenas que ainda existem nos Estados Unidos. As tentativas de reverter a orientação sexual têm diferentes nomes: cura gay, terapia de conversão, terapia de reparação ou até conversão espiritual. Até 2012, não havia lei no país proibindo a cura gay. Hoje, 11 estados americanos proíbem essa prática para menores de 18 anos, mas 39 ainda não aprovaram legislação sobre o tema.
My parents didn't ask any questions past that moment because they believed, like hundreds of thousands of believers like them, that the church could not be wrong. And these are church leaders, you know, it's a very patriarchal system. So these church leaders are saying, this is what you're supposed to do. My dad's not going to question that. And he's becoming a preacher. So why would he go against an entire industry that says this is the right thing to do? And I think a lot of people tend to forget this, but we know now because Mike Pence once supported conversion therapy, but there was a lot of political weight behind conversion therapy, and there was a lot of free airtime in our news media for it, and it wasn't exactly critical. I mean, there were critical angles, but, you know, for lack of a better word, abuser, John Smid, who performed conversion therapy on me, he was on CNN, he was on Larry King Live. One of the heads of all these organizations was on the cover of Newsweek with his ex-lesbian wife together. You know, they were given tons of airtime, and it legitimized them. So, you know, now if you get online and you go to Google and type in conversion therapy, you'll see my movie, you'll see, you know, organizations fighting against this. But back then in 2004, when I went to conversion therapy, if you typed in conversion therapy, you'd get positive results. It would be like, here's where you go, here's how you send your kid there. So we're living in a different time, but I would also argue that it's not that different, because although, you know, Google results might be different, these worlds, when I go back to Mountain Home, Arkansas, to my state, which is more conservative than New York, it feels the same. And many of these kids, these queer kids that I speak with that are, you know, high school age, they say, all of that feels like a fantasy. The world that I see you in New York, in, you know, these gay clubs that are positive, or these pride parades, they aren't my world. I can see them on a screen, I can see that they exist, but it doesn't feel like reality to me.
Their parents are still sending them to conversion therapy?
Yeah, I mean, it's not as prevalent. I would say, thanks to my story, most people aren't sending their kids to conversion therapy in Arkansas, I would hope. But it's definitely still happening, and it's gone underground since all of this attention has been brought on it. Many people have stripped away the words conversion therapy, and they've changed the words to something like reparative therapy or family Christian counseling, which then results in the same thing. But it's become a bad word to use.
Apesar das denúncias, críticas e da crescente pressão de grupos e associações para a proibição total dos centros de cura gay nos Estados Unidos, a prática ainda afeta milhares de jovens americanos. Um estudo do Williams Institute, da Universidade da Califórnia em Los Angeles, aponta que 700 mil americanos já passaram por algum tipo de tentativa de conversão sexual em algum ponto de suas vidas. A cada ano, 20 mil adolescentes entre as idades de 13 e 17 anos são enviados por seus pais para algum centro de conversão ou tratamento individual com terapeutas em consultórios. A pesquisa diz ainda que líderes religiosos ou espirituais oferecem a tal cura gay a 57 mil jovens todos os anos. Outro número alarmante desse estudo aponta que de 1.600.000 moradores de rua nos Estados Unidos com menos de 18 anos, 40% são jovens que foram expulsos de casa por serem LGBT.
Another fact that shocks people is that transgender people are more likely to be put into conversion therapy. They're the biggest clients.
Tell our viewers, I mean, I don't want to spoil the film and the book, what happens in those places?
Well, Love in Action, where I went in Memphis, Tennessee, it was a very unique place, to say the least. They decided to combine this idea of Alcoholics Anonymous, the 12-step program.
They treat being gay or lesbian
as
being addicted.
Yeah.
As an addiction.
Yeah, so we were, like, our fantasies, our sexual desires were seen as an addiction that we could conquer. And I remember I grew up with these ideas, one of them being, we would be told, hey, you know, sometimes you have violent thoughts. Sometimes you think about strangling someone and you get mad. You don't do it, right? So the same thing would apply to homosexual tendencies. Like, you may feel this attraction, but you don't act on it. And that kind of logic works really well for a kid, right? Like, it seems like a simple solution. Just don't kill someone, don't have sex with a man. And so that worked for a while. And when I encountered this idea that my homosexuality was an addiction, it wasn't that surprising to me. Not to mention the fact that these people that I met were very nice, very welcoming. It felt like a nice Sunday school meeting. You know, we were going to go read the Bible together and talk about God and maybe sing some songs. So that was one aspect of it. We went through a 12-step program, which was designed to lead us out of our addiction. The other innovation that Love in Action created, and it seems absurd at first, but I'll explain it, they combined people that were dealing with bestiality, pedophilia, marriage issues, trans issues, things like that. We were all placed in the same group under the assumption that we were all addicted to something evil. Now that sounds crazy, right? But think back to the number of conversations you've heard from people who have said, well, if we give gay people the right to marry, then they'll marry horses, or they'll marry cows, or you know, whatever. It's like this slippery slope argument that something terrible will happen if we grant people their rights.
Argumentos desse tipo vêm ganhando espaço em muitos países que experimentam os efeitos de governos conservadores. Efeitos desse avanço da direita e do nacionalismo para as minorias LGBT têm representado a defesa de tratamentos que remetem à cura gay e tentativas de revogar direitos, como o casamento entre pessoas do mesmo sexo. Nos Estados Unidos, o presidente Trump tem lutado para proibir a entrada de transgêneros nas Forças Armadas. Na Rússia, Vladimir Putin tem proibido paradas gays em Moscou e foi acusado de fazer vista grossa à matança de homossexuais em campos de concentração na Chechênia, que é uma província russa. No Brasil, o Conselho Federal de Psicologia proibiu as práticas de cura gay 20 anos atrás, em 1999. Mas, em 2017, um juiz federal levantou a proibição. E desde então, psicólogos e ativistas lutam no Supremo Tribunal Federal para reverter a decisão. No Congresso, um projeto de lei criado por um deputado que é pastor evangélico, em 2016, para permitir a modificação de orientação sexual, ainda está em tramitação.
There are lots of myths around this, which is that, oh, this is a crazy thing that only happens in America, for example, or in these crazy communities that are backwater. But the truth is it happens all over. And it's born out of a kind of bigotry that has existed in the country since its founding. It's not that surprising, you know?
You cannot convert a queer person into a straight person.
Not that I know
It doesn't
of.
happen. But can you convert a bigot into a tolerant person?
You know, I think that, I hate to call my mom a once bigot, but I think she was, and she'll admit that. So I've seen it firsthand. Now, mothers are easier to turn because they love their children, and it's hard, you know, to sever that connection is difficult, but I've seen it happen. So my mom is someone who, you know, she didn't know that I was gay, but she would make fun of gay people, and she would say the most terrible things, and I would sort of listen to her and think, I can't ever tell her or else she'll stop loving me. And she, you know, she made mistakes. She followed along with my father. She wasn't the most supportive with my first boyfriends. She didn't want to know things. But I remember one day we were talking about like her change and how she had come to support me. And she said one day, which for years she had prayed that God would change me. She prayed every day. And then suddenly she prayed the prayer that if she needed to change, that she would. And she said the next day she woke up and she was fine. And I don't know if that was like some sort of real God connection she had, or if it was just her telling herself it's okay to think this. But she did. And I know maybe it's stupid to think that people can change. I don't know. I've become a bit more cynical in 2018, 2019. But I don't think that kind of optimism is stupid. I think that it's necessary. Because otherwise, what's the point?
I love God and I love my son. For your father, it's a little more complicated.
O milênio está de volta. Nesse bloco, Garrard Conley nos conta mais sobre como reconstruiu a relação com os pais dele e como foi visitar os sets de filmagem e ver a história dele ganhar vida nas telas do cinema.
I think about men. I don't know why. And I'm so sorry.
When your dad found out, he told you that he would not pay for your college, that you were not welcome at home.
That I wouldn't
if you
speak
didn't
to my
change,
parents.
right?
Yeah.
And then he changed because he accepted you in a way. So how was it for him?
Well, I think that he suddenly saw how stubborn I could be. You know, like, I'd been the best kid in the world. I mean, seriously, I'd never done anything that was the slightest bit odd to him. You know, I was just a normal kid. And so this was the first time when I came back from conversion therapy where I stood up to him and I said, like, we're not going to talk about this anymore. Like, what you did was harmful, and, like, I'm not talking about it. And I think he was very shocked to meet this, I guess, man now who was standing up to him and not just going to listen to what he had to say. And it's been a process of that over the years. My mom has had the unfortunate role of being like an arbiter between us, because she can translate both of our languages and sort of make everything okay. But at a certain point, that was one Christmas, I think 4 years ago, it was before the book came out, but she knew I was writing it. And it was Christmas. She'd just gotten over a cancer scare. She thought she had cancer, and it like changed her life, as it does many people. And she said, I'm not gonna sit here and control this anymore. Like, I'm going into the bedroom, you two figure it out. And she just walked off, and Dad and I had a really intense conversation, and I said, you know, 100 years from now, if we're all still alive, who knows, climate change. But I said, if we're still here, our family is going to be remembered for what I've done, not for what you've done. And that's just the way things are going. So if you want a good account, you should probably get on my side at some point. And I said, because this kind of bigotry that has been in our family, and I said, I'm not erasing the whole family, but this strain of bigotry that we've had, whether it's against black people or against LGBTQ people, it has to go. And this is the next generation. And when I marry a man, I'm now married, but at that point I wasn't. So when I marry a man, his name is next to mine in the family tree, and there's nothing you can do about it. It's just a fact.
They came for the wedding?
No. I just went to the city hall because I was like, I'm not even going to bother with that.
Okay.
Yeah.
So how was it seeing your story on the big screen?
Well, the first time I saw it, I mean, I was on set many times. So I was prepared for the intensity. I saw many of the scenes being performed, and it was very emotional, especially since the first time I went on set, it was a recreation of my time in conversion therapy, and it was very accurate. But when I watched it all the way through, I was so embarrassed that was my life. I remember thinking, like, it looks so sad up there, you know, it looks like I'm just this sad person, you know. And
it ends well.
Yeah, it does, but there's a lot of darkness in it.
If you could speak to the Brazilian viewers who are going to watch this, and there's a kid who is queer, or a transgender kid, or their parents, their parents who are still, what do I do with this? What would you tell them?
Well, I think to the kid, I would say, start keeping a record of what's happening to you. Because right now, you think it's all hopeless and that there's no story here. You think that it's just sadness. But your life is part of a much bigger story. And so this, however dark it is going to be something that you need to learn from, and something that later will energize you. Because if they're already in that position, it's already sad. There's nothing I can do to get them out of that. Because many kids can't just leave their towns and their families. They don't have enough money to just go off and you know, live in a big city. So I would say, yes, it sucks. It's really bad right now. But start remembering it. Start thinking of it almost as though you're a character in a larger story. That's what helped me. For the parents, I would say, like, I know you don't agree with your kid, and I know that you're worried for them, probably, but think for a second. If there's the smallest chance that this is torture and that this could ruin their lives, are you willing to take that gamble? Are you willing to take the gamble on ruining your kid's life after so many years of watching over them?
Thank you.
Оружие в руках и в тылу